Good morning and welcome to version number 2 of the 2023 revival of the Mark V podcast, sponsored by the Veterinary Virtual Care Association, VVCA. And it's an effort to give some structure and an overview and catch people up on where we are with the debate, particularly over the telemedicine VCPR and whether that's appropriate or you must require people to have an in-person visit. So let's start with a reminder of what do the laws look like right now across the country, and that would be all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And of course, the place to find out, if you have any questions, is the VVCA's telemedicine map. And that's been one of the most popular services that the VVCA has provided to our to the country, if you will, and to the industry and to pet owners. And it's vvca.org. Go to resources, you'll see telemedicine map, and you can click on your state. You can read the language yourself. You don't have to hear or rely on my interpretation. And what you'll see is an interesting checkerboard with multiple colors of how states approach this. So there are a group of states. I think the number is 8. The biggest of those states is Texas, that say absolutely not. You cannot use telemedicine or electronic tool to create a VCPR. There are 7 states where you can. And, you know, I've got those memorized. It's not 10, it's not 20, but the number's not 1 either. And that's Idaho. That had been Michigan. It's not right now. There's legislation to change that. New York, because it doesn't have a VCPR. I want to repeat that. The state of New York does not use the VCPR in their Practice Act to structure how people get care for their pets. New Jersey, Virginia, Florida has a VCPR friendly telemedicine rule, but you can't prescribe off of that. So, but it is a telemedicine VCPR state. Oklahoma, and now Arizona. Then you have a group of states that represent a slight majority of states where there's a question. There's some ambiguity. What's that ambiguity? If it's a state that the Practice Act says you must have physically examined or physically seen the pet, that's clearly got to take place in a place like a clinic. That's in person. So telemedicine VCPR wouldn't work there. There's a number of states, and this is the largest block of states, which have a term of examined or physically examine the animal. Now, physically examine the animal, of course, doesn't leave any room for doubt that the animal physically is in your presence. But some of that language is not prefaced by physically, so some of those states become open to question. And then another category referring to recently seen or have acquaintance with the animal, and that's a smaller group of states. And the arguments made that one can see or be acquainted with a pet or an animal through a virtual tool, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever you might use, or you could examine, frankly, a pet through a virtual tool. And there's not been any litigation yet or any board actions that we're aware of challenging it. So that remains one of a number of sort of open questions now as we do look down the road to where veterinary telemedicine is going. One could argue, and some do argue and have been allowed to go forward, that the scene or exam could be through virtual or technology means, real, FaceTime, Zoom, and so forth. Others argue that that's meant to be seen in person, examined in the clinic. That's reading into it, but I can understand why people would say that was probably the expectation at the time. So there's those states, and you've got this mixture now. So what people would like, I think, is clarity. And from the VVCA perspective, clarity isn't wide open, where you've got companies in Sri Lanka just calling in and pretending like they know something about veterinary medicine, but very basic guard rules. And those guard rules have been what? They've been, the veterinarian must be licensed in the state where the pet resides, number one. Doesn't matter whether you're located there, because if it's virtual, you could be a licensed Missouri vet, but you might be in Kansas City at the time of the call, number one. Number two, you have to give the pet owner the choice, in person or virtual. Number three, most importantly, the veterinarian has to be confident that she has the tools she needs, that she's confident she can make decisions and she can help put together a treatment and get started with the pet owner to give them some help. Number four, no controlled substances can be prescribed with only a telemedicine VCPR. We don't want to create that scenario. And in some states, they're separating out food animals from companion animals. BVCA's view isn't that it's not necessary, but politically that may be popular. So those kind of guardrails are basic. And obviously, everybody, whatever state you live in, you have to pay attention to federal law and so forth. No one's contesting that. So if you will, that's the current landscape. Now, in my last podcast, I told you what states have been active and how it's shifting in a manner that looks like major states are going to open the door. And that's what happened in human medicine. But let's go through what the arguments are. And I want to be fair to both, but so you evaluate. It's as if you're in a jury and you're listening to closing arguments in a case, which is where I've spent a lot of my life as a lawyer. But let's take the arguments that the AVMA and most state VMAs that tend to fall in line with the AVMA thinking. What has been their argument against the telemedicine VCPR? And I'll just list it. I'll make some comments on it. You decide for yourself. What you hear all the time is that it's just better medicine if it's in person. In person is better than virtual. And they tend to imply that there's no situation where virtual care, live, real-time virtual care can match in-person care. The response to that, of course, is in this era of shortages, where 25% of pet owners now have had difficulty getting an appointment or been unable to get an appointment in the last year. It's pretty academic to say in-person is better if you can't get an in-person appointment. And so is it better to have no care at all or some care? That argument tends to fall on deaf ears with most legislators, I will tell you, when they think about it, because they're aware of the shortage. So whether it's better or not is purely theoretical if you don't have a chance at having an appointment. The second argument is that predictions of great harm occurring to pets and to animals in a non-pet situation, if you aren't in person, that somehow there's going to be a misdiagnosis. There'll be misdiagnoses all over the place. They'll be rampant. Therefore, you can't trust telemedicine. I want to spend some time on that one because I don't think that should be a position, if you think about it, that a trade association of professionals, licensed veterinarians, should make. Why? That's a harsh statement from me, but I think it's deserved. Why is that deserved? Because the foundation of that claim that something bad's going to happen to the pet, that a mistake's going to be made, is the foundation of that is that the veterinarian is negligent, that they've made a mistake, that they think they know something they don't. In other words, they don't trust the veterinarian. And I don't think veterinarians deserve to not be trusted. Somebody who's a good veterinarian on Monday and Tuesday in their clinic, who decides on Wednesday to provide some telemedicine service, she doesn't overnight become a bad veterinarian. She doesn't overnight forget what she needs to know or be careful about or watch out for. And the implication of that is serious. And I don't think it's fair. If you think about it, probably by noon every day in America, there have been a minimum of 100,000, maybe 250,000 judgment calls made by veterinarians in clinics, right? Nobody's in the room. They're not being videotaped. No one's evaluating them. They're not calling people for advice. They're making an individual judgment, which professionals are trained to do, about what to do with the pet. You know what? They understand that, and no one assumes that there's bad judgment being made across this country all day long. It's just not the case. Vet schools do a good job of training. The NAVLE does a good job of testing. Practices do a good job of onboarding. I mean, all those things allow us to have a good, healthy, well-functioned profession in this country. And the idea that all those things go out the window with telemedicine doesn't make sense. And there's a better argument against it I'll get to in a minute. You often hear critics say federal law prohibits it. You can't do telemedicine because the federal government prohibits it. News alert, not true, not the case. The Federal Food and Drug Administration has a rule that says a pet must be examined before an extra label drug, i.e. an off-label drug, can be prescribed. They don't even use the term physical in there, but I think the implication is that that's a traditional VCPR. They're not banning telemedicine. They're just saying if you're going to prescribe, or people assume they're saying, if you're going to prescribe an extra label drug, you had to have had an examination, which the implication is it's in person. The federal government in no way has stepped across the line and tried to tell all 50 states, you can't utilize telemedicine. You can't create a VCPR that way. And I would expect the FDA, as telemedicine on the pet side becomes as popular as it is on the human side, will conform its rules and clear that up in the near term. You'll hear the threat that in-person visits to clinic are going to end or shrink, causing great economic harm to veterinarians. And there's a lot of people that suspect that what's behind most opposition to telemedicine is an economic fear. Well, go spend some time with human medicine. My wife's on faculty at Mayo Clinic. I get my medical care quite fortunately at Mayo Clinic. Often my Mayo Clinic visits are by telemedicine. I'm paying for those visits. I don't get those for free. And they're quality visits. And I think the notion that telemedicine takes away business from a clinic, no, smart clinics, now increasing number of clinics, find that their clients love the mixture of in-person and virtual. When you can't get in, when it's not convenient, but you want some help, and people don't expect to get that for free. The other argument you'll hear, it was the case in Michigan and Arizona, is that food animals will never have another in-person visit once you go to telemedicine. I don't think so. I don't think dairy practitioners are going out of business. Yes, it's true, telemedicine can be very helpful in the West in particular, where you've got hours and hours of driving in between ranches. But the notion that telemedicine will wipe out in-person care, again, it's speculation. And finally, if there's one argument for telemedicine that trumps all, it's probably that the shortage of veterinarians right now means a lot of people can't get care. If they can't get care in person, why wouldn't we want them to get some form of care? And we're told, well, no, don't worry about that argument because the shortage is not an issue. Or as one national leader said, it's a blip. I think it's clear now as we sit here in the summer of 2023 that we're in the midst of a long-term serious shortage, acute shortage, all sorts of factors that I won't run through because you all know them. And the idea that telemedicine couldn't be a tool to help people that can't get in to see a clinic that simply doesn't have enough people, it's surviving on a relief vet who's there 2 days a week. And I've seen practices like that here in Arizona. The shortage is not about to end. And the rationale that the shortage provides for any form of care like telemedicine isn't going away. So that's kind of the argument. It's said different ways, but we hear that all the time. Now you switch to what's the argument for telemedicine? In many cases, there's one argument and you don't need a second. It works for people. Why wouldn't it work for pets? All 50 states have approved starting the doctor-patient relationship through telemedicine on the human side. And the argument that somehow none of that applies to veterinary care, you decide. Because the best case that's made for that is, well, pets can't talk. And supposedly that means you have to be in the clinic. Well, the point is, young children can't talk. Many people with disabilities can't talk. People in severe accidents may not be able to communicate. seniors or people with advanced end-of-life illnesses and limitations may not be able to speak. And what do you do there? Does telemedicine go away? Of course not. The same arguments, the same rationale applies. People, friends, husbands, wives, parents, lovers, partners, whatever it may be, they're resources that you use to figure out how to care for that person that can't communicate. And telemedicine is used all the time. And human medical societies approve it, encourage it, and have confirmed how valuable it is. So the argument that it works for people and not pets doesn't go very far. And that's probably as big an issue that caused the law to get changed in Arizona. People just said, why not? Third is that you have Ontario, just north of Michigan in Canada, 15 million people, big city like Toronto. They've had full-on telemedicine for 6 years. No harm to a pet ever reported. I'm going to repeat that. 6 years, all the claims of how diagnoses will be missed, all the mayhem and problems that could be caused, not a single claim has ever been made that a pet was harmed. And that's confirmed in person by Jan Robinson, the executive director of the Ontario College, which is their name for their governing board. And Jan said that about 65% of practices are utilizing it now and very comfortable with it. In the States, you don't want to listen to Canada, in the States, 19 waived the in-person VCPR requirement during COVID for social distancing reasons, right? That made sense. None of those states reported harm to animals because telemedicine was being used to create a VCPR. And I can assure you, if it hadn't been that way, we'd have heard about it. And the BVCA would have had to address that. It didn't happen. So what you have are all the cases of telemedicine being legal for a VCPR have led to no reported harm to a pet. On the other side, speculation about all the damage. You know what? Veterinarians are scientists. They're trained to be medical professionals. If you look at the facts, telemedicine works. Now, we have good surveys and good studies I'll talk about in my next podcast that roughly 25% of pet owners have access to care issues. And we also know that 40% of pet owners don't go in clinic anyway for their pets. They get care some other way. So you've got a huge block of people that need alternatives. And to say either shame on you, you don't deserve a pet because you aren't going to a clinic, particularly when you can't get an appointment, doesn't make any sense. I've told you before that we make the argument that relinquishments are beginning to pick up the pace of people taking pets back to shelters because they can't get care or can't afford care. Remember that the telemedicine provisions that are legal in this country, that are supported by the BVCA, all have a foundation of what? It's the judgment of the veterinarian that drives this. If she doesn't think she's got enough information from the telemedicine tool, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever, then don't have telemedicine. Have the person come into a clinic. And that happens all the time. But why wouldn't we trust the judgment of the veterinarian? We do every day anyway in clinics, and it shouldn't make any difference outside the clinic. We also require informed consent by the pet owner. The laws say, give them a choice. If they say, you know what, I want to come in, try to find them an appointment. There's no forcing of a vet to provide telemedicine if she's not comfortable. And there's no forcing of a pet owner to accept telemedicine if they're not comfortable. It's simply a tool that can be used for the reasons that we've covered. And finally, I think you'll see that telemedicine ultimately can lower the cost of care. And for many people in America, that's crucial. So those are the arguments. They don't seem to change much. And I think you're going to see fewer and fewer arguments against, but that's the state of play right now as we enter the summer of 2023. Thanks for returning to Mark 5 Podcast, sponsored by BVCA.
This episode was sponsored by My Simple Pet Lab. Meet the future of pet wellness made simple. By vets, for pets. My Simple Pet Lab delivers pet care solutions that are fast, simple, and reliable. From vet-approved routine pet wellness tests, care kits, to over-the-counter products. Keeping your pet healthy has never been easier. Check out mysimplepetlab.com for more information.